Welcome to Generational Trek, a Star Trek TNG podcast with your hosts, Taylor Anderson and
Nicholas Anderson.
Generational Trek is a podcast of a dad and son doing a series watch of Star Trek The Next Generation. In each episode, we'll provide a very brief recap of the episode. We'll then go through the episode, highlighting interesting parts of the episode, humorous portions, and looking for some important takeaways. So today's the premiere episode, Episode 1, Season 1, Encounter at Farpoint, the very first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. And before we get too far into that episode, I'll give a little bit of background on I grew up watching Star Trek The Next Generation. That was my Star Trek as a young man that was about your age.
And I am just starting to get into Star Trek The Next Generation. I watched it as a kid, but we are completely rewatching the series to see what it's like because I don't really remember much about it.
Yeah, you saw just a few episodes. We really haven't watched a lot of episodes, and certainly not in order. So this week's episode, Encounter at Farpoint's a long episode, so that makes it a little bit more challenging, especially starting off on your first podcast with it. But that's all right. We're going to read the brief recap from Memory Alpha. Memory Alpha is a great resource for Star Trek information. So I'm going to give you the brief recap of that, which is Captain Jean-Luc Picard leads the crew of the USS Enterprise D on its maiden voyage to examine a new planetary station for trade with the Federation. On the way, they encounter Q, an omnipotent extra-dimensional being who challenges humanity as a barbaric inferior species. Picard and his crew must hold off Q's challenge and solve the puzzle of Farpoint Station on Deneb 4, a base that is far more than it seems to be. And so we go in to find out that, of course, Deneb 4 is kind of more of a primitive culture of humanoids. They look surprisingly like humans. But we find out that Farpoint Station, in fact, is not a station at all. It is, in fact, another being that is being essentially held hostage by the inhabitants of Deneb 4. We go on to find out it escapes from Deneb 4 with the help of the Enterprise. And so that's how the episode ends. It actually ends with Q telling Captain Picard that he'll be watching. And so we'll see how that plays out for the rest of the series. Of course, I've seen it, so I know what's going to happen with Q. You're going to find out what goes on with Q in the future. So with that, tell me your initial impressions of this 1987 TV episode. What did you think?
All right, so first, I think that the green screen was really good, especially for its time.
Well, I don't know that they necessarily used a green screen. I mean, they used it a little bit, but those early, the 80s television episodes, in particular Star Trek, actually used a lot of models. So the Enterprise is a model, not a CGI.
Just like put a string attached to a toy.
Well, actually, when they went back and redid the Star Trek: The Next Generation in high definition format for the Blu-rays, and we're watching it on Netflix, which has the HD version of it. I think it actually shows how good models versus CGI, how much more, in my opinion, much more realistic the modeling looks versus a lot of CGI. It's gotten better recently, but I still have a place in my heart for the models.
So what was that? What was the jellyfish? Was that also a model?
That probably was. That's a good question. That probably was some sort of CGI, and I think they've enhanced it for the Blu-rays. So the jellyfish, the space jellyfish, it was probably some sort of a computer-generated jellyfish. But what did you think of the set of the Enterprise D? What did you think of it versus you've seen the original series? Actually, you've seen some of the movies from the original series. What did you think of that? What did you think of the set?
I liked it. It kind of felt roomy or almost at home, informal while also being formal, if you know what I mean. It's a really well done set, and I think I'm glad that I've heard that they keep it for most of the episodes, as the Enterprise D probably is still going to be alive for most of the show.
Well, we'll see some minor tweaks to the Enterprise set, but yeah, it remains largely the same. It was actually called the Hilton in space. It was more like a hotel in space than it was a spaceship. We were up until really the Enterprise D. Most of the spaceships we saw had little knobs and switches and flashy lights and things like that.
Wait,
whereas
doesn't that already have it, as explained by Wesley?
Well, yeah, I mean the Enterprise D is very clean, very slick. It's all touch interface, which for 1987 was very forward thinking at the time, and so it had a completely different look and feel than really any other spaceship we had seen to that time. It was very, very clean, and the bridge was just, sparkling. We saw a little bit of engineering in this episode. It was much cleaner than what we had seen in previous versions of the Enterprise, in original 1701 and then A through C. But anyway, it was it took a while for me coming from the original series, and in particular, I loved the Enterprise 1701 refit that was used in the motion picture and Wrath of Khan. And
Wrath of Khan.
But we won't get too much into that. But coming from that to, it took a little bit of getting used to the Enterprise D. It was much bigger than the original Enterprise, and certainly had a very different look. But anyway, so getting back to Encounter at Farpoint, I've got a few notes here. We get introduced, of course, to the crew. I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts on the crew? What's your initial thoughts of Captain Picard?
All right. Well, he seems like a leader, but I'm kind of questioning his treatment with Wesley, as you can see he's clearly a full-grown teenager, and he treats him kind of like a toddler. And people that say that they hate kids are kind of hypocritical. There's no way to get around being a hypocrite. I mean, I can get if he was actually a toddler that he wouldn't allow him on the bridge, but I'm pretty sure someone that's more than 10 years old can probably be trustworthy around it, knows the responsibility that the bridge holds, especially being in the captain's seats.
Yeah, we find out Wesley's probably about your age, and we find out right away that Wesley is a bit of a genius. He kind of knows all the things that are the Enterprise. And we also find out, of course, that Captain Picard knows Wesley, and in particular knows his mom, Beverly Crusher, who's the doctor, that there's a relationship there, and that Captain Picard actually brought Wesley's dad, who died, back to him. And so we find out that there's a relationship there. Of course, they hadn't seen Wesley in many years. He does tell right off the bat that he does not like children, that Captain Picard does not like children. And then he's initially impressed by Wesley's knowledge, but then Wesley touches a button on the captain's chair, and Captain Picard is not too happy about that, tells him to get off his bridge. Dr. Crusher gets a little dig in there, which is kind of funny. Got a little bit of humor injected into it. And so it's a tough intro. I tell you this, Captain Picard's I think his demeanor is going to change a lot as he settles into the role, as Patrick Stewart settles into that role, and he will obviously become a very, very, he'd be a great character going forward. What about Commander Riker? What do you think about him?
At first glance, there wasn't really much of him in the first episode.
Right.
We
meet him towards the end of the episode. He's kind of out. He doesn't start on the bridge.
He's kind of spaced out. Ha 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 ha. A funny XD joke.
Yeah, he doesn't come in until really the second half of this episode, and it is really a 2-part episode. So yeah, you're right. We don't get to see a lot of Riker. What about Data? Commander Data? He's a lieutenant commander, I guess, in this to start out here.
I'm actually surprised. I forgot who said that he didn't like androids. Who was that? Was that Riker?
It was kind of Riker. Was a little. We called him Pinocchio when they were in the holodeck together, and it's interesting in this episode. Data shows a lot of emotion, but we find out that he doesn't have capability of feeling emotions. But his face and his demeanor and his body language actually show a lot of emotion. And so I will tell you this, we're going to see Data kind of change and evolve a little bit through the series. Mm-hmm. It is interesting. And it's interesting, too, Data says in there he doesn't know what the word snoop means. I don't know how a essentially a walking Google
dictionary. Yeah.
The guy has everything, all knowledge you would think in his possession, and he doesn't know what Snoop is. So he goes through all these different things and annoys people. I think it's more of a comedy routine. But anyway, all right. So we have Worf, who is a Klingon. What do you think of Worf?
He seems to be very loyal and like to the point. He seems to be pretty serious about his job, and I assume as a Klingon, that's probably going to be like him.
Yep. Yeah. Then we have the chief. Well, he's not chief engineer yet. I get a little ahead of myself because I'm so used to them in their later roles.
Mhm.
But we have Geordi LaForge. What do you think of Geordi? He is the blind pilot, essentially, of the. It's a bit ironic there, but he's the blind pilot of the Enterprise.
So I'm kind of fascinated by the device that he gets to kind of cure his blindness.
Yeah, the visor. Mm-hmm.
Does that only sense heat signatures on a spectrum, or does it actually project that spectrum into the world so he can basically see everything, but like colorblind instead of fully blind?
Well, we'll get into that. We're actually going to have an episode where we kind of get to see what he sees. So we'll save it for that. We'll save that for that. So we've got security officer Tasha Yar.
I remember something about Tasha Yar, but I'll save that for later.
Yeah. Yep.
She seems also to be kind of out there, like Riker, but she seemed like a young intern, like excited to get into her role and everything. So
security officer, so she's very much security minded. She gets frozen by Q.
Yes.
At one point, gets frozen.
I think she gets frozen by Q twice.
So yeah, it's a little that. So that's it's an interesting one. What about Counselor Deanna Troi, who, by the way, is wearing a uniform in this episode, and keep that in mind because that's going to change. She's wearing a Starfleet uniform, but things are going to change for that.
Pain.
Yes.
Pain is all I feel.
That's right. She does get a little bit of drama acting in there when she senses the pain of the jellyfish alien creature who is being held hostage at Farpoint Station. She senses that jellyfish's pain, and we get to hear that a lot.
I think Counselor Troi, does she end up becoming like a bartender?
No, that's a different character. We'll talk about her when we get introduced to her, since she wasn't introduced in this episode. So we'll talk about her when we get there. But no, Deanna Troi is the counselor. She's half Beta Z, so she. Beta Zeds are empathic, telepathic because they can actually communicate. But she is more an empath. She can sense emotions because she's half Beta Z, half human. So
the funny thing is, us humans already can sense each other's emotions. I guess you could say through body language, or really just anything. I kind of found that funny, like they were portraying it to be something that only a Beta Z could do.
Yeah, it's interesting. In this first episode, they actually use her really well and with her empathic abilities, because she actually senses. We don't know that Farpoint Station is actually an alien, but she's clearly sensing something, and so they use her well in this episode. What's a bit ironic is going forward, she doesn't get used as well as going forward. I don't think as they do in this episode. We talked a little bit about Beverly Crusher, who's the chief medical officer on board the Enterprise, with her son Wesley. We don't get to see a whole lot of Dr. Crusher in this episode.
I feel like she was only in 2 minutes of the full episode when she was introducing Wesley to Captain Picard. Yeah,
we kind of get a little bit of the backstory there. But we don't get a whole lot on her. So anyway, let's get into a little bit more now that we've kind of gone through our initial impressions of that. Some things I noticed about Picard was, I find it was a little bit funny when he's talking to Q when they're putting humanity on trial. He keeps calling the uniforms worn by the military of the past costumes.
Yes.
It's a little bit ironic, right? I mean, it looks like he almost looks like
he's got the red jumpsuit.
Yeah, he's got a red jumpsuit. Looks kind of like pajamas. But calling those costumes. He's certainly not afraid of a challenge.
No. And I think he's incredibly brave. I mean, challenging what seems to be an omnipotent being that can transform anything and freeze anything at will. basically sizing him up.
Yeah. What I thought was funny too is we hear in previous movies in the original series movies, we find out that there is no money in the future. But Beverly says when she's looking at that bolt of fabric to charge it to her room, which kind of leads to that whole hotel in the sky thing. But what is that? I wonder what that means. They never really kind of get into that. I thought that was kind of funny. And here's another thing. Riker comes on board, and the first thing he does, he watches the first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. They send him into a room, and they turn on the first half of Encounter at Farpoint. They put it on a screen for him to watch. So it's kind of ironic. Riker gets to actually watch the first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, just as we saw it.
Wait a second. What,
Did you notice that?
No, I didn't.
We'll have to rewatch that. He actually watches. Maybe they've got cameras. Like they've got cameras everywhere, recording everything.
That's a funny little Easter egg.
There you go.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
I mean that's actually. What if he can now tell the future? What if they can tell the future, and that's how they figured out everything?
Well, we find out that Q, of course, can see the future. But I thought the old Bandy City looks like an 1800s Old West town.
Yeah.
First podcast, so we're going to have to roll with us for a minute. Anyway, I thought that was pretty funny. And, of course, we mentioned Riker doesn't seem to like Data very much.
I think that partially, I think he's just kind of discriminant against androids going with the AI. It's going to take over the world thing.
Well, and Data says, prejudice is human. So do you agree with that?
Yep. I mean, our history shows it, if anything.
Well, and of course we see, they don't tell you who he is, but we see Dr. McCoy. He's 130-something years old, talking to Data. They're walking down the corridor there. They don't actually identify him as Dr. McCoy, but it's clearly Dr. McCoy.
Mm-hmm.
And I love his line. He says, talking about the Enterprise, he says, treat her like a lady and she'll always bring you home. So we'll see if that's true. We're going to see if that's true. All right, so I got some questions for you.
All right.
Just in general, what do you think of the Enterprise?
The Enterprise is a really cool place. I mean, I'm fascinated by the ISS, and that's like, 1/100th of the size, if even that, to the USS Enterprise. I mean, I'm all about that space stuff.
Yeah.
So seeing a kind of cruise ship in space, but like way upgraded.
Right.
It's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, the holodecks were pretty interesting.
Also, do they have like simulated gravity? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, now I don't know all of the intricate details of that. We can look into that because we've got the Star Trek Encyclopedia and all of that, so we can explore that. But yeah, that's they do have a gravity generator on board that simulates gravity.
How that would work? I wonder if it's like a contained black hole, even though that wouldn't technically work.
No, it's not that. We'll look into that. I thought what was a really cool shot was when they did the saucer separation. Yes. That view from behind, where you see the pylons that actually hold the saucer in place to the drive section. I thought that was a really cool special effect that they did in there.
I mean, like, they don't need to do it, but yet they added it. I love when people add intricate details that are meaningful, but most people wouldn't pay attention to it.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that I really do appreciate. And I try to seek out, actually, most of the time as well.
Did you notice that the World War III soldiers were controlled by drugs? Is that they saw that? That was a little...
Yeah, I mean, though it's not far off from a lot of things today. I mean, like Sudan, when they were fighting in a civil war, essentially used drugged kids to try to fight for them. And also, their uniforms looked like a disco ball, pretty much. I mean, you'd think, oh yeah, so we're in a war and we need to have something to blend in so that our soldiers don't get shot. What should we use? Literally every reflective surface that there is. Okay.
Yeah, it's. I thought Q takes us through the history of humanity up, kind of, particularly from World War II to World War III. Q gives humanity a pretty hard time. Says that we're pretty much
And also, I like how he says that literally all of us are the same. Like, he's comparing Captain Picard to someone like 600 plus years ago, as if, like, and even if he lived in that same time period, you can't compare someone to, like, mentally insane people that start wars.
Yeah, that's a fair argument. Q is clearly not a big fan of humanity. Obviously, putting humanity on trial and saying a lot of things out there that.
And also, I mean, technically in this universe, I think you can change the past, but that's besides the point. You can't really change the past, and people, born in the future have no control over what we have done in the past. It's just not possible.
Right. Yeah, that's true. If we were constantly held to our lowest and worst point in humanity's history,
then I bet we absolutely would deserve
harsh judgment, for sure. Mm-hmm. So hopefully the time in which Picard exists, hopefully we're there at that same century, that point in time.
But I mean, Picard is a good guy. I mean, he obviously demonstrates. But one question that I did have.
What's that? Is
that he said trial that's harder than you can imagine, and then after that it cuts. And I honestly think that the investigation, that was all going to go as planned. I mean, they weren't really looking for any quote-unquote trial, so I was wondering in the episode if that was like some kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but like they just cut the trial and then just, transported them magically back to their ship, which they also don't show, by the way. They just show one shot of like Q saying, hardest trial you're going to imagine, and all of a sudden they're like right back on the ship with no chance,
Well, Q is omnipotent, so he can do anything he wants, and so he kind of just has to snap his fingers or think or whatever, and it makes that kind of flashy sound, and it kind of makes that noise. That little, it's really just a TV way of explaining what's happening to those characters at that time. But you're right, we don't really get resolution, but I will tell you to stay tuned because we're going to see a reference back to this eventually. So stay tuned. We're going to get a resolution to this, I promise you, and I think you're going to like it. It'll be a little bit though. We're not going to get there right away.
And also, I think that here's what I'm kind of saying is like, wouldn't they be surprised or some kind of startled to be right back on the ship, especially not knowing that they could have been warped to like some alternate universe, but they seem completely fine only milliseconds after they got warped back to their ship with no warning, by the way?
Well, yeah, I think that's fair. It's a good question. We'll have to talk about that a little more as we go forward about some of the limitations of TV series and things like that. You'll find in Star Trek, I think you're going to find, especially in the Next Generation, as it was in the original series, that they have very short memories. Things that happened in a previous episode rarely get referenced in the following episodes. It's not like today's serialized TV. Each episode, which I actually kind of like, you can actually watch just about any episode of Next Gen as a standalone episode, which is both a strength and a weakness.
Oh yeah, in the Amazing World of Gumball, literally anything they could do, they could kill people, and they would just come back the next day like nothing happened.
Well, that doesn't happen in Star Trek unless they go into alternate universes. But let's not worry about that because we don't do that in this episode. All right. So anything else you want to talk about with this episode? We're going to try and hold our podcast to about 30 minutes. We're not going to try and go too long over that. So
I don't know. But
you got anything else? This one's a long episode, so it's our first podcast. So we'll cut ourselves some slack because we don't really actually have anybody to answer to it besides ourselves.
So first question: why is Warp 10 inachievable, and what is Warp 10?
Okay, so warp is, of course, is a warping of space, so that that's how they can travel faster than light, and of course make it across long distances in space. Warp 10 is the theoretical. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, other than warp 10 is kind of like that unachievable speed, infinity speed, I guess you would call it. Although we're going to find out, I think, later and in the future, that the warp factors are kind of malleable. I think the writers kind of did some of that, but it's a logarithmic scale. It's not a straight scale, so it's not like warp 2 is 2 times the speed of light.
It's not.
No,
okay.
No, it's a logarithmic scale, not a linear scale. So
log 4x equals 2.
That's right. So that's what, and we can talk about that.
Oh yeah. Also for saucer separation.
Yeah.
Are you basically just sacrificing lower ranked people?
No. So the Enterprise is because it's a deep space exploratory vessel. They have this huge ship that can carry families. And the idea is that you could put the families on the saucer. It could escape, and the drive section, which has the battle bridge that we saw in this episode, which, by the way, the battle bridge is a redress of the original, or of the movie series bridge of the Enterprise. So it's actually the Enterprise Enterprise and the Enterprise A. It's that bridge just redressed as the battle bridge for the Enterprise D. And but the idea is that the saucer families and all of the non-commissioned, I guess, folks would get on the saucer. It would separate. It could escape, and then the drive section, which has all of your torpedoes, it has phasers, and is shielding and all of that, could take on whatever enemy was there. So that was the idea behind that. So it's not sacrificing them. They're actually moving them to the saucer, separating it, letting them escape, and then the drive section would go on and fight the battle if it had to.
Okay. Next question. There was for the Farpoint station, they initiated an evacuation order. I know that. However, they really had like maybe 2 minutes to get off of the whole planet before the jellyfish came, and there was like there was no ships shown leaving. So were they just converted into the jellyfish?
No, I think, again, we're talking about TV. Since it wasn't the whole planet, it was just that Farpoint station that converted back to the jellyfish. I think that, the folks just got out of there as fast as they could. As long as they were away from Farpoint Station, they could go back to the blown up Bandy Village, I guess. I don't know. I don't know exactly what's going to happen to the Bandy. We don't actually go back and visit the Bandy in Next Gen. So I don't know. I don't know what happens to the Bandy, but they clearly did not make it into the Federation.
I think that last town, right, was the last surviving town or something.
I don't know. They just call it the old Bandy Village. So I don't know. We don't find out a lot about the Bandy.
So I think that okay. So next question. So the court,
right? That Q made appear, the kind of the show trial that Q was putting on.
So Yar says that she has seen the court and like she was in one of them, but it was like 500 years ago, like at that point. So how does that work?
Well, I think we're gonna find a little bit more about Yar, about her backstory, in some future episodes. But she came from a pretty tough place, from a colony that was pretty bad. She kind of has a pretty rough childhood that we'll find out in the future. So we'll save that for that. But yeah, she's referencing back to some of what her childhood was like.
Also, I would like the chair that Q has as the judge. That was pretty sweet.
Be a heck of an office chair, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like, just you basically being able to fly with a chair.
Yeah, it's pretty much a flying chair kind of thing. It would be interesting to see how they actually constructed that for the judge at that point in time in history, how that whole thing worked. So
especially that it seemed like, I mean, it looked like the medieval periods.
Well, and I think that was the point of what Q was bringing humanity back to that point. That was after World War III. We end up with a nuclear war, essentially, where humanity is almost entirely wiped out. And he takes us back. So we actually regress as a species, as humans actually regress from where we are today back through World War III, and there's the eugenics wars, and there's a lot of history there.
Eugenics wars?
Yeah, well, that's where Khan came from.
Oh, okay.
So we actually regress pretty significantly until we discover warp technology, and we have first contact, which of course happens in the movies of Next Gen. We get to see that, but once we have first contact, we kind of start that evolution to a more unified Earth, which actually is referenced in this. Is called Unified Earth in the 2030s. We're almost to the 2030s.
That's kind of scary when you think about it. So last thing.
Mm-hmm.
How the book Vendetta, Star Trek Vendetta, does that play into any of the first episode, or is that something that happens later?
Oh my! I haven't read Vendetta in so long. I know you read it recently. I haven't read it in so long. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. So and the books aren't canon. So they're not.
Oh, they're not?
No, the books aren't canon.
Well,
only whatever's shown on TV or in the movies is considered canon. So the books aren't canon, even though there's some great books out there that really kind of explain some of the backstory and give you a lot more detail, but they're not canon. So,
all right.
But anyway.
Honestly, though, Q still kind of I don't know how to describe it, but he's kind of an odd character, seeing as he can only think of past humans. He doesn't even know what present humans are like.
Well, and he probably does because he's omnipotent, although we don't know exactly what that means, right?
Although he showed himself, he showed himself as a Shakespearean person the first time. Although I will say he did know about World War III. But, why would he start, with Shakespearean?
Well, we're going to see a lot of Q. And Q in my opinion, Q is a great character. He's going to give us a lot of great episodes. And,
the writing is great. For the first episode, if you want to do it, you got to look at Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yeah, the first episode is a pretty well-written first episode. We're gonna struggle. Just to preview a little bit, we're going to struggle through some of the first two seasons. Mm-hmm. Some episodes are just spectacular in the first two seasons, and some are absolutely terrible, in my opinion. So I'm curious to see if you can figure out which ones I think are really good and which ones are really terrible. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to this. It's our first episode. We made it through Encounter at Farpoint. Looking forward to doing episode 2, which will be much shorter. Be half the time. It's a 43-minute-ish episode. 43
minutes? That's not that long.
No, well, this is a tough one, this Encounter at Farpoint. There's a lot going on in this episode, but looking forward to it. I as Picard says in this episode, let's see what's out there. So let's see what's out there. Looking forward to it, buddy.
All right. Thank you. I'm glad to also do this. Thank you guys for watching.
Watching? We're not watching.
Well, that is true. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah, I've been told many times I have a face for radio.
Yes. So. Eventually we'll probably have to start uploading talks maybe to my YouTube channel.
Maybe. Well, we appreciate you all listening out there, and look forward to episode 2, the next episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. So we'll see you soon.